For 3 years, every job I applied for disappeared overnight. Not after a background check, not after a bad interview, after a phone call. Someone would call the company, sometimes the day before my interview, sometimes a few hours after, and calmly tell them that I had a criminal record. Theft, fraud, something serious enough to make employers nervous. None of it was true, but by the time I turned 31, I had stopped trying to explain that. Because after the 12th job offer vanished the same way, the problem was no longer convincing strangers. The problem was surviving. My name is Emily Carter, and the reason I spent last winter sleeping in a Honda Civic behind a Walmart in Boise, Idaho, was my parents, Richard and Linda Carter. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten me. They simply picked up the phone every single time I tried to work. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. Employers were polite, but distant. We decided to go in another direction. The position has been filled. Something came up in your background. That last one was the moment everything tilted. I remember sitting across from a store manager in Meridian, Idaho. He was a man about my father's age. Gray hair, reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. He looked uncomfortable. "Emily," he said carefully, "is there anything you want to tell me about?" "A felony." I stared at him. A felony. I had never even gotten a parking ticket. I drove home that afternoon, trying to convince myself it was a mistake, a mix-up in a database somewhere. But mistakes don't repeat themselves 12 times. And they definitely don't come with text messages, like the one waiting on my phone that night. From my father. "Come home. Apologize. Maybe we can fix this." At first, I didn't connect the two things. Not until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Interview scheduled, phone call made, job gone. Over and over again. The last interview I lost was for a small office assistant position in Nampa. I had actually shaken the manager's hand. We had talked about starting Monday. By Thursday morning, the offer was gone. The email was short. "We received concerning information about your background." That night, I was sitting in my car in the Walmart parking lot, watching the blue glow of the store lights reflect across my windshield. The Honda Civic had 187,000 miles on it, and a heater that worked when it felt like it. The back seat was piled with everything I owned: 2 bags of clothes, a blanket, a grocery sack with toiletries. I had stopped counting how many rejection emails were saved on my phone, but I kept every one of them, and I kept every text message my father sent. The newest one arrived just after midnight. "Still cold out there. Come home and apologize. You don't belong out there, Emily." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. For most of my life, my parents had called what they did protecting me. But there's a strange moment when something you've lived with for years suddenly becomes clear. Sitting in that freezing car, I finally understood the truth. They weren't protecting me. They were trapping me. I had just turned off my phone to save the battery when there was a knock on the window. 3 soft taps. I froze. It was almost midnight. No one walks through a Walmart parking lot in January, knocking on strangers' cars. I turned slowly and looked through the glass. A woman stood outside under the fluorescent lights. Mid-50s, short gray hair, wearing a navy coat and holding a leather briefcase. She waited patiently until I cracked the window an inch. "Emily Carter?" she asked. My stomach tightened. "Yes." The woman nodded once. "My name is Marissa Lang," she said calmly. "I'm an attorney from Portland." She paused, studying my face, like she had been looking for it for a long time. "I was hired by your grandmother," she said. "June Mercer." And then, She said the sentence that changed everything. She told me to find you when things got this bad. Long before I slept, in a Walmart parking lot, before the rejection emails, and the strange phone calls, my life followed rules that no one ever wrote down. But everyone in my family understood them. I grew up in Twin Falls, Idaho, a town where people waved at each other in grocery store aisles and church parking lots filled up before the morning service even started. My parents, Richard and Linda Carter, were the kind of people others trusted. My father managed a shipping warehouse just outside town. He had worked there nearly 20 years, the kind of man who wore the same watch every day and believed hard work solved most problems. My mother handled bookkeeping for a small church office 3 days a week. She knew everyone's birthdays, everyone's casseroles, and everyone's business, in a place like Twin Falls that mattered. From the outside, our family looked steady, responsible, respectable. People told my parents they had raised a good daughter. What they didn't see were the quiet rules that shaped my life long before I ever tried to leave home. I didn't have my own bank account. When I started working part-time at 19 stocking shelves at a grocery store on Blue Lakes Boulevard, my paychecks went into a joint account my mother managed for safekeeping. She would smile when she said that. "You're young Emily," she'd tell me. "Money disappears fast if you're not careful." I never questioned it. The same went for my paperwork. My Social Security card, my birth certificate, those were kept in a small metal lockbox in my parents' bedroom closet. Important documents belong somewhere safe, my father liked to say. It sounded reasonable at the time. Most of the rules did. When I finished community college, I started talking about moving to Boise. It was only 2 hours away, but to my parents, it might as well have been another country. My father listened quietly the first time I mentioned it over dinner. He buttered a piece of bread, set the knife down carefully, and said something I would hear many times after that. "Emily, the world isn't as friendly as you think." My mother nodded beside him. "Girls your age get into trouble when they rush into independence. They never yelled. That wasn't their style. They simply explained things until my plans sounded unreasonable even to me. The funny thing about control is that when it's gentle enough, you don't recognize it as control. You think it's advice, concern, protection. For years, I believed that. The only person who ever spoke differently was my grandmother, June Mercer. She lived across the state line in Pendleton, Oregon, on a small property with a white farmhouse and a garden she worked every spring. My grandmother had a quiet voice and a way of saying things that made people uncomfortable because they were true. The last time I visited her alone, I was 26. We sat on her porch, drinking iced tea, while the wind moved through the wheat fields behind her house. She watched me for a long moment before asking a simple question. "Emily, do you ever make decisions your parents don't like?" I laughed. "Not really." Grandma June didn't laugh. Instead, she reached over and squeezed my hand. "Every grown woman needs to learn," how she said softly. At the time, I thought she was just being stubborn in the way grandmothers sometimes are. I didn't know she had already seen something in my parents that I hadn't. A year later, she passed away quietly in a hospital in Pendleton after a short illness. My father handled most of the arrangements. After the funeral, life in Twin Falls returned to its normal rhythm. Work, dinner, church, polite conversations about sensible choices. It wasn't until 2 years after Grandma June died that I finally did something my parents didn't approve of. I applied for a job in Boise. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night, filling out the online application. It was for a small office assistant position at a supply company downtown. Full-time, health insurance, Nothing glamorous. But it was a beginning. When I clicked the submit button, my hands were shaking. Not because I was afraid of the job, because somewhere deep down, I knew I had just broken one of the family rules. 2 days later, the company emailed me. They wanted to schedule an interview. At the time, I thought that message was the start of my new life. I didn't know it would also be the beginning of everything falling apart. The interview in Boise was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I remember the date because I wrote it 3 different times in my planner, the way people do when something matters more than they want to admit. March 12th. The office was downtown, on the 3rd floor of a narrow brick building above a coffee shop that smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon. The company sold construction supplies to contractors around southern Idaho. It wasn't glamorous work, but the receptionist had a desk with a window and a steady paycheck. For me, it felt like a doorway. I left Twin Falls before sunrise and drove the 2 hours to Boise in my old Honda Civic, the same car that would eventually become my bedroom years later. That morning, though it was just a car, the interview went better than I expected. The office manager, a man named Greg Hollis, looked to be in his late 50s. He had the calm, slightly tired demeanor of someone who had worked in the same industry a long time. We talked about my community college classes, my experience stocking inventory at the grocery store, and the basic office tasks the job required. Phones, scheduling, invoices, nothing complicated. Before I left, Greg stood up, shook my hand, and said something that made the drive home feel shorter. "We'll probably move forward pretty quickly on this, Emily." I remember sitting in my car outside the building afterward, smiling at nothing in particular. It felt like the first real step toward the life I had been quietly imagining for years. 2 days later, the email arrived. It was polite, brief, and completely different from the conversation I remembered. "Emily, thank you for coming in. After reviewing some information regarding your background, we've decided not to move forward with your application." I read the sentence 3 times. Regarding your background. That phrase stuck in my head. I called the office that afternoon, expecting a misunderstanding. Greg answered the phone himself. For a moment, he sounded almost relieved to hear my voice. But when I asked about the email, his tone shifted. Careful, measured. "Emily," he said slowly, "someone contacted the office yesterday." I sat down at the kitchen table. "Contacted you?" "Yes." There was a pause on the line. "Is there anything in your past we should know about?" I didn't understand the question at first. "What do you mean?" Greg cleared his throat. "The caller said you had a criminal history. Theft, specifically." The word sat in the air between us. Theft. My heart began to pound in a strange, slow rhythm. "That's not true," I said immediately. "I've never been arrested." Greg didn't argue, but he didn't sound convinced either. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "We just can't take that risk." When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone. My parents were in the living room watching television. I could hear my father laugh at something on the news. For a few minutes, I tried to convince myself it was just a mistake. Maybe someone had the wrong Emily Carter. Maybe a database error somewhere. But over the next 6 weeks, the same thing happened again and again. A grocery store in Jerome called to schedule an interview. 2 days later, the position had been filled. A warehouse outside Nampa asked me to come in. The interview was canceled the morning of. Each time, the explanation sounded almost identical. Something came up. Information we received. Background concerns. The 3rd time it happened, I stopped believing in coincidences. The first real clue came from a place I hadn't expected. A diner in a small town called Buell. The owner, a woman named Patricia Pat Larkin, interviewed me for a breakfast shift job. She looked to be in her 60s and had the direct, no-nonsense way of speaking that comes from decades in the restaurant business. After our conversation, she wiped her hands on a towel and leaned across the counter. "You seem like a hard worker," she said. "I'd give you a chance." For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. But 2 days later, when I stopped by the diner to ask about the schedule, Pat asked me to sit down in one of the booths. She didn't look angry, just uncomfortable. "Emily," she said quietly, "I got a call about you." My chest tightened. "What kind of call?" Pat hesitated. "Someone said you'd been in trouble with the law. Serious trouble." The same story, the same accusation. But this time, Pat added something new. "I asked who was calling," she said. "And what did they say?" Pat looked down at the counter for a moment before answering. "They said they were a concerned family member." I drove home from Buell with the radio off. The highway stretched out in front of me, miles of empty Idaho farmland, under a pale afternoon sky. I kept replaying Pat's words in my head. A concerned family member. When I pulled into our driveway in Twin Falls, my father was sitting on the porch reading the newspaper. He looked up as I stepped out of the car. "How'd the job hunt go today?" he asked. His voice was casual, almost friendly. I stood there for a second longer than necessary. Then I forced a smile. "Still looking," I said. He nodded once and turned the page of the newspaper. At the time, I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't confront my parents. I didn't even say the thought out loud. But that night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, I realized something unsettling. For the first time, the question in my mind wasn't why someone was calling employers about me. The question was who. After Pat Larkin said a concerned family member, I started listening to my life the way you listen to a house at night. Not the obvious noises, the subtle ones. The way my mother stopped talking the second I walked into a room. The way my father's eyes followed me when I picked up my keys. The way the printer in the hallway seemed to run more often when I wasn't looking. I didn't accuse them. I didn't even ask a question I wasn't ready to hear the answer to. Instead, I did the only thing I could do without blowing up my life. I tried to get proof that I was clean. On a Monday morning in early April, I drove to the county sheriff's office in Twin Falls and asked how to request a copy of my criminal history. The woman behind the glass window slid a form toward me like she'd done it 1,000 times. I stared at the paperwork and felt my stomach drop. It required a valid government ID. Mine was in my father's lockbox. I could have asked for it. I could have made it a fight, but I wasn't ready for war. Not yet, so I left. I went to the public library instead, the one off Filer Avenue, and used a computer in the back row to pull up the state background check resources. Everything I could access showed nothing. No arrests, no charges, no record, which should have been comforting. Instead, it made me feel even more trapped because it meant I was being punished for something that didn't exist. And the punishment was working. I kept applying anyway. I widened my search to places my parents wouldn't normally drive past. A medical supply warehouse in Jerome, a front desk job at a small motel in Mountain Home, a part-time office position in Kuna. Each application felt like tossing a paper airplane into a storm. Sometimes I'd get a call. Sometimes I'd get an interview. And then, almost like clockwork, the air would change. An email would arrive with that careful, vague phrasing. "We received information. We have concerns. We're moving in a different direction." By mid-April, even the people who cared about me started speaking in that cautious tone adults use when they're afraid of making things worse. My aunt called one evening. My mother's sister, Sharon, the one who always brought banana bread to family gatherings and wore perfume that smelled like lilacs. She didn't mention jobs. She asked if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping. Then she said, almost as if she couldn't help herself, "Your parents are worried sick, Emily. Worried." That word was starting to feel like a weapon. The next day, my father texted me again. Same message, same shape. "Come home. Apologize. We can talk." It wasn't a conversation. It was an offer with terms. And the terms were clear: my freedom in exchange for my obedience. That's when the pressure stopped being emotional and started becoming practical. The owner of the small basement apartment I rented, Mrs. Halverson, a retired school secretary, knocked on my door one afternoon, holding her phone like it was something unpleasant. Her cheeks were flushed. "I don't usually do this," she said, "but I got a call about you." My mouth went dry. "What kind of call?" She looked embarrassed. "A woman said she was trying to help. She said you had a history, that I should be careful." A history. I knew what she meant without her saying it. Criminal record. Again, Mrs. Halverson wasn't accusing me. She was asking me to reassure her. But I could see something shifting behind her eyes. Uncertainty. Doubt, the instinct to protect herself. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the stack of printed rejection emails I'd started keeping in a folder. The folder was thin, but it was growing. On top of it was my phone lit up with my father's newest text. "Still cold out there. You can end this." I didn't reply. I didn't confront them. I just lay awake, listening to the hum of the old heater in the distant traffic, realizing a hard truth. If someone could call my landlord, too, then this wasn't just about stopping me from working. It was about making sure I couldn't stay anywhere without them. And I could feel the walls starting to close. The call to my landlord changed the air in my apartment. Mrs. Halverson didn't evict me that day, but she started locking her own door sooner, and she stopped making small talk in the hallway. The building felt tighter, like the walls had moved an inch closer while I was at work searching. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was warning. In Twin Falls, people didn't need proof to pull away. They just needed a reason to feel cautious. And someone was giving them that reason, one phone call at a time. By the end of April, I was behind on rent. My savings, what little I'd managed to keep, was bleeding out in gas application fees and cheap meals I ate in my car between interviews. I didn't have a safety net, or at least I thought I didn't, because one Thursday evening, as I stood in the kitchen making boxed macaroni, my mother walked in and set a stack of mail beside the sink like she was placing down evidence. "Your Aunt Sharon called," she said casually. "She's worried." I didn't answer. My father was in the living room, the TV loud enough to fill every silence. Then my mother said, in the same tone she used for weather reports and grocery lists, "You know this could all stop." I looked at her. She met my eyes for a second, just a second, and then looked away. In that small movement, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not yet. It was a kind of clarity that felt cold and steady. The next day, I drove to the credit union where our joint account was held. I told myself I was only going to check the balance. I wanted to know how close I was to drowning. The teller smiled, asked for my ID. I didn't have it. I stood there, heat rising in my face, and walked back out to my car, feeling smaller than when I'd walked in. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the old heater click on and off, and I thought about what my grandmother June had asked me on her porch in Pendleton. "Do you ever make decisions your parents don't like?" I finally had an answer. Yes, and I was going to make one more. The decision formed quietly, the way grown-up decisions often do, without drama, without a speech. I was leaving, not moving to Boise with a neat plan and a job offer, leaving in the way people leave when the door closes behind them. I waited until Sunday afternoon when my parents went to a neighbor's barbecue and the house was empty. I moved quickly, but carefully, like I was afraid the walls might remember what I was doing. I packed a backpack, 2 changes of clothes, my toiletries, my phone charger, a small framed photo of Grandma June I kept in my dresser drawer. Then I walked into my parents' bedroom closet and stared at the metal lockbox on the shelf. I didn't have the key. Of course I didn't. I stood there for a long moment, breathing through the panic, and I realized the truth. They never intended for me to have it. My documents were leverage. My identity was leverage. Everything I needed to survive in the adult world was something they could withhold to keep me dependent. I took what I could and left the rest. When my parents came home, I was in the kitchen. My backpack sat by the door. My father looked at it, then at me. My mother's mouth tightened. "Where are you going?" she asked. I kept my voice calm, because I could feel how badly they wanted me to crack. "I'm leaving," I said. My father set down his keys slowly, like he was making a point. "You walk out that door," he said. "You walk out with nothing." Then he added quieter, "No money, no papers, no help." My mother stepped closer. "If you leave," she said, "don't come crawling back." I looked at their faces, 2 people who had raised me, fed me, taught me manners, and somehow convinced themselves this was love. And I understood something I'd been avoiding for months. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a system. I picked up my backpack, opened the front door, and stepped onto the porch. The air outside was cool, the sun already dropping behind the houses. I got into my Honda Civic and drove away. By the time I reached the edge of town, my phone buzzed. A text from my father. "Come home. Apologize. I'll stop." I didn't text back. I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and kept driving, knowing I had just crossed the line that made everything irreversible. The night I left Twin Falls, I drove until the gas gauge dipped below a quarter tank. I didn't have a destination. I only had distance. By the time I reached Boise, the sky had gone dark, and the parking lot lights of a Walmart on the edge of town were glowing like a small, artificial city. That's where I slept the first night, and the second. People imagine homelessness as chaos, but the truth is, it becomes routine very quickly. You learn which parking lots are quiet, which gas stations leave their bathrooms unlocked early in the morning, which diners will let you sit with a coffee for an hour without asking questions. My Honda Civic became a kind of tiny, uncomfortable apartment. Back seat for storage, driver's seat for sleeping. Phone always plugged into the cigarette lighter because it was the only lifeline I had left. My father kept texting. The messages never changed. "Come home. Apologize. We can fix this." I stopped replying after the 3rd day. Silence was the only boundary I had left. During the day, I drove to libraries and coffee shops to use Wi-Fi and apply for jobs farther from Twin Falls than my parents could easily reach. Nampa, Caldwell, even Ontario, Oregon. For a while, I thought distance might solve the problem. Then, one Thursday afternoon, I walked out of a job interview at a small office supply company in Meridian, feeling cautiously hopeful. The manager had smiled. He had said, "We'll call you tomorrow." The next morning, an email arrived. "We've received information regarding your background." The same words, the same careful language. the same invisible hand closing another door. I sat in my car, staring at the message, feeling something inside me settle into a harder shape. For months, I had tried to ignore what the pattern meant. Now, I couldn't pretend anymore. Someone was still calling, and the only people who had ever demanded I stop working were my parents. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the Boise foothills, I was sitting in the driver's seat of my Civic, trying to decide what my next move should be. That's when the knock came. 3 gentle taps on the passenger window. For a moment, my entire body froze. The parking lot was mostly empty, the air cooling down quickly as evening settled in. I turned my head slowly. A woman stood outside the car, under the yellow glow of the parking lot light. Mid-50s, maybe. Short gray hair, navy coat, and in her hand was a brown leather briefcase that looked old enough to belong in a law office. She waited patiently until I rolled the window down an inch. "Emily Carter?" she asked. I nodded cautiously. "Yes, my name is Marissa Lang," she said. "I'm an attorney from Portland, Oregon." The word attorney immediately tightened something in my chest. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" I asked before I could stop myself. Marissa shook her head. "No, quite the opposite." She opened the briefcase slowly, careful not to startle me. Inside was a cream-colored envelope sealed with a strip of tape. My name was written across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. For a moment, the entire world seemed to narrow to that single line of ink. Emily. The handwriting belonged to my grandmother, June Mercer. My fingers hovered in the air without touching the envelope. "My grandmother passed away 2 years ago," I said quietly. "I know," Marissa replied. "She hired me 10 years ago." The number landed like a stone in my mind. 10 years. "She told me something very specific," Marissa continued. Her voice was calm, professional, but there was something softer underneath it. "She said, if things ever got bad for you, I should find you." I stared at the envelope again. "What do you mean bad?" Marissa watched my car for a moment, the blankets in the back seat, the grocery bag of clothes, the exhaustion I hadn't bothered to hide. Then she answered gently. I believe she said this is exactly what she meant. For the first time since leaving home, I felt something different from fear. Not relief, not yet, but the sense that somewhere, years before any of this happened, someone had seen the storm coming and left me a map. Marissa Lang didn't ask me to step out of the car. Instead, she suggested we walk to the edge of the Walmart parking lot, where a small diner stayed open all night. The kind of place with fluorescent lights and laminated menus that had probably been there since the 1980s. We sat in a booth by the window. I ordered coffee because it was the cheapest thing on the menu, and because my hands needed something to hold. The envelope sat on the table between us. My name was written in Grandma June's careful handwriting, the same way she used to label jars of blackberry jam in her pantry in Pendleton. I hadn't seen that handwriting in 2 years. My fingers felt strangely heavy when I finally peeled back the tape. Inside were 3 things: a letter, a folded legal document, and a small key attached to a brass tag. I opened the letter first. Emily, if you are reading this, then something in your life has gone very wrong. I wish I could say that surprises me. But the truth is, I prepared for this possibility many years ago. The words blurred for a moment before I forced myself to continue. Your parents love control more than they love freedom. I learned that when you were still a little girl. If they ever tried to stop you from building your own life, I wanted you to have a door they could not lock. Marissa sat quietly while I read. 10 years ago, I placed something aside for you, not as a gift, but as protection. The key in this envelope belongs to a safe deposit box at Columbia River Credit Union in Portland. Inside are documents that belong to you, proof of your identity, copies of records, and something else I believed you might need if the day ever came when the truth had to be seen. I lowered the letter slowly. The diner noise, the clink of dishes, the murmur of conversations seemed suddenly far away. Your grandmother was very deliberate, Marissa said gently. She wanted this delivered only under specific circumstances. I looked up, and this counts as those circumstances. Marissa glanced briefly out the window toward my car. The sleeping arrangement suggests it might. I let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. For the first time in months, someone was speaking about my situation without pretending it was normal. "What's in the box?" I asked. Marissa tapped the folded document I hadn't opened yet. "That," she said, "is the legal authorization your grandmother signed. It allows me to represent you, if necessary." I unfolded the paper. Even without reading every line, I could recognize the language of something serious. Signatures, notarization stamps, dates from a decade earlier. Grandma June had planned this, planned for the possibility that her granddaughter might someday need legal protection from her own parents. My chest tightened. "I thought she was just being cautious," I said. Marissa shook her head slightly. She wasn't guessing. A silence settled between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my throat since she knocked on my car window. "If my parents have been calling employers," I said slowly, "is there anything I can actually do about it?" Marissa leaned back in the booth. "Yes," she said simply, but she didn't smile. However, she added, "there is a complication." The word complication made my stomach drop. "Your grandmother suspected something else might happen." "What do you mean?" Marissa slid a second sheet of paper across the table. It was a printed document. At the top was a familiar logo, a regional background screening company based in Idaho. I stared at the page. There, under my name, was a short report summary. "Criminal record review required," but the line beneath it was worse. "Source of report request, Carter Family Services." My last name sat there in plain black text. Carter. The diner seemed to tilt slightly. "That company," Marissa said quietly, "has been submitting background inquiries under your name." My throat went dry. "Meaning what?" "Meaning someone connected to your family has likely been feeding false reports into hiring channels." The room suddenly felt smaller. If this was true, it wasn't just rumors anymore. It was paperwork, systems, a trail, and somewhere out there, my parents probably believed the story they'd built around me was still working. Marissa folded her hands on the table. "We can stop it," she said. "But once we start..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to, because I already understood the part she left unsaid. Stopping it would mean dragging the truth into the open. And once that happened, nothing in my family would ever look the same again. The next morning was Monday. Marissa Lang picked me up outside the same Walmart parking lot just after sunrise. The sky over Boise was pale and cold, the kind of quiet blue that only shows up early in the day. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't starting the morning wondering where I would charge my phone. We were driving to Portland. The safe deposit box my grandmother had mentioned was at Columbia River Credit Union, and the branch manager had confirmed they could open it with the legal authorization Marissa carried. The drive took most of the morning. I spent the first hour staring out the window while Idaho farmland slipped past the car, replaying everything I had learned the night before. Carter Family Services. The name sounded official, professional. But the truth was simpler. My father had registered a small consulting company years earlier, mostly for tax purposes, and occasional bookkeeping work he did for local businesses. It had never meant much, until now. If they used the company name, I said quietly, it would look legitimate to employers. Marissa nodded. Exactly. She kept her eyes on the highway. A background screening company isn't verifying every call personally. If someone submits information through a registered business account, it carries weight, even if the information is false, especially if the person presenting it sounds confident. Her words settled into something heavy inside my chest. For 3 years, my parents hadn't just been spreading rumors. They had been feeding those rumors into systems designed to be trusted, which meant undoing the damage would take more than explaining myself. It would require proof. By early afternoon, we reached Portland. The credit union branch sat on a quiet street, lined with tall maple trees that were just beginning to show early autumn color. Inside the lobby smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. The branch manager, a calm man in his 60s, named Robert Ellison, reviewed the documents Marissa handed him. He studied the legal authorization for a long moment before nodding. Your grandmother was very thorough, he said. Then he led us into the vault. The safe deposit box was smaller than I expected, a narrow metal drawer no bigger than a hardcover book. Robert placed it on a small table in a private viewing room and stepped outside. For a moment, neither Marissa nor I moved. Then I slid the key into the lock. Inside were several sealed folders, birth records, certified copies of identification documents, a notarized affidavit from my grandmother, and one thick envelope labeled in her handwriting, employment records. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were printed copies of emails, call logs, and something else I hadn't expected. Letters from employers, dozens of them, many dated years earlier, each one describing the same strange situation. A phone call, warning them about Emily Carter. A concerned parent, insisting their daughter was unstable. A criminal history that did not exist. The paper in my hands suddenly felt heavier. She documented everything I whispered. Marissa nodded. She suspected this might happen long before it did. I flipped through the pages. Near the bottom of the stack was something that made me stop breathing for a moment. A printed voicemail transcript from a construction supply company in Boise. The caller had identified himself by name, Richard Carter, my father. The room seemed to go completely still. For the first time since this nightmare started, there was no ambiguity, no guessing. There was proof, hard, quiet, undeniable proof, sitting in a folder my grandmother had hidden for a decade. Marissa folded her hands on the table. This changes things, she said. I looked down at the documents again. Months earlier, I had been trying to survive. Now, I was holding the evidence that explained why survival had become so hard. Is this enough? I asked. Marissa considered the question carefully. It's a beginning, she said. Then she met my eyes. And sometimes, she added, the beginning is the most dangerous part. Because once a system built on lies begins to break, the people who built it rarely stay quiet. And somewhere back in Idaho, my parents still believed they were in control of the story. They just didn't know yet that the story had started to turn. The first papers were filed on a Tuesday in early October. Marissa made sure of that. No holiday weekends. No, we'll get to it Monday. No delays that let fear grow in the gaps. By the time the courthouse in Twin Falls opened for business, she already had a binder on her lap and a calm expression that made it hard for anyone to dismiss what we were doing as family drama. I sat beside her in the passenger seat of her rental car, with my hands folded so tightly my knuckles ached. My Honda Civic was still in Boise, still my backup plan. But for the first time, I wasn't living day to day. We were moving something forward. Marissa's complaint wasn't emotional. It was precise. Defamation, tortious interference with prospective employment, identity misuse. She attached the evidence my grandmother had stored for 10 years, the voicemail transcript with my father's name, employer letters, describing the calls, the background screening printout that listed Carter Family Services as the source of the inquiry. Paper doesn't care who your parents are. Paper cares what you did. The process server reached my parents' house on Maple Street just after noon. Marissa didn't go with him. She didn't have to. But by 2 o'clock, my phone started buzzing. Aunt Sharon was first. Her voice sounded thin, like she was trying to talk through disbelief. "Emily, what is going on? Your dad says he's being attacked." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. Not over the phone, not to someone who still wanted to believe the Carter family was respectable. "I'm handling it legally," I said quietly. Then I ended the call. By evening, the texts from my father began. The first one was almost polite. "This is ridiculous. Call me." I didn't respond. The second one came an hour later. "Your mother is sobbing. Is that what you want?" Then the third, "You're humiliating us." By the fourth message, the tone sharpened into something familiar. Control disguised as concern. "You don't understand what you're doing. Come home. We'll talk." I set the phone down and stared at the wall of Marissa's hotel room, listening to the air conditioner hum. For years, those words had been enough to pull me back. This time, I did nothing. 2 days later, the town began to notice. Twin Falls is the kind of place where people read public records the way they read church bulletins, quietly, thoroughly, and with a lot of judgment. Someone at the diner in Buell printed out the complaint. Someone else highlighted the part about the criminal record lie. And suddenly, the story my parents had been telling about me started to collapse under the weight of dates and details. A contractor in Boise called Marissa's office and left a message. He said he had listened to the voicemail years ago and always felt uneasy about it. He still had it saved. He was willing to testify. Then, the office manager from that supply company, Greg Hollis, emailed too. He remembered my face. He remembered the call. He admitted in writing that the warning about theft had been what cost me the job. The evidence chain tightened like a knot. My parents responded the only way they knew how. They tried to control the narrative. My father signed up to speak at a community meeting in Twin Falls that Thursday night. It wasn't a dramatic rally, just a small local session where people came to complain about zoning and school funding. But he stood at the microphone anyway. Marissa and I sat 3 rows back, not hiding, not flinching. Richard Carter talked about a daughter who'd been influenced. He talked about outsiders. He talked about a family matter. Then Marissa stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult him. She simply held up a copy of the public filing. "If anyone here wants the truth," she said evenly, "it's available to read." The room went quiet in the way rooms do when people realize they've been manipulated. I could feel eyes turning not toward me with pity, but toward my father with questions. And for the first time, the power in that room shifted. Not because I shouted, not because I begged, but because the record official, dated undeniable, had started speaking louder than he could. That night, my father sent one more text. It was short. It wasn't concern. It was fear. "This isn't over." I stared at the screen for a long time. He was right about one thing. It wasn't over. But for the first time in years, it also wasn't in his hands anymore. The court hearing happened on a Wednesday morning in late November. Twin Falls County Courthouse was smaller than people imagine when they think about justice. No towering marble halls, just worn wooden benches, fluorescent lights, and the quiet murmur of people waiting for their cases to be called. But that morning, the room felt heavier than usual. My parents sat together at the defense table. For the first time since this began, they looked smaller, not physically, emotionally. My father, Richard Carter, kept his jaw tight the way he did when he believed stubbornness alone could win an argument. My mother stared down at the table, like she might disappear if she avoided eye contact long enough. Marissa sat beside me with the same calm focus she had carried from the beginning. On the table in front of her was the binder. 10 years of preparation my grandmother had quietly put into motion. When the judge entered, the room stood. Then everything moved quickly. Marissa didn't shout. She didn't dramatize anything. She simply walked the court through the record. Employer statements, the Boise voicemail transcript, where my father identified himself, the background screening report tied to Carter Family Services, a timeline showing 3 years of interference with job offers across southern Idaho, paper after paper, fact after fact. When the judge turned to my father, the question was simple. Did you place these calls? For a moment, Richard Carter tried to maintain the story he had told the town. He spoke about concern, about protecting family, about misunderstanding. But records have a way of closing doors that excuses cannot open. The judge's voice remained steady. This court is not here to interpret family relationships, he said. It is here to determine whether actions caused measurable harm. And the harm was clear. Lost employment, housing instability, documented interference. By early afternoon, the ruling came. The court issued a permanent injunction preventing my parents from contacting any employer connected to me. They were ordered to formally retract the criminal allegations in writing to every company named in the complaint. Financial damages were awarded for lost income and legal costs. And the false reporting submitted through Carter Family Services was referred for further investigation. No shouting, no dramatic speeches, just consequences. Outside the courthouse, the November air felt sharp and clean. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my father stepped toward me, not angry this time, just tired. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly. For most of my life, those words would have cracked something open inside me. But now they landed differently. Yes, I said gently. I did. My mother didn't say anything. She looked at me for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the parking lot beside my father. And just like that, the fight that had shaped years of my life ended without another word. A week later, something strange happened. Greg Hollis, the office manager from the construction supply company in Boise, called me. I owe you an apology, he said. Then he asked if I was still looking for work. The job wasn't glamorous. Phones, scheduling, invoices. But when I walked into that office on my first morning in December, sunlight poured through the window beside my desk. For the first time in years, the door behind me wasn't being held shut by someone else. I rented a small studio apartment near the river in Boise. My Honda Civic finally became just a car again. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, I sit on the balcony with a cup of coffee and think about my grandmother, June. 10 years before any of this unfolded, she saw something most people refuse to see: control disguised as love. And she left me a key. Not just the one that opened the safe deposit box, the one that opened a life they could never lock again. If this story reminded you of someone who fought quietly for their dignity, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Stories about family justice and healing matter more than we realize. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you can follow along and join me in the next one.